The Jews of Greece were mostly Sephardic. They were expulsees of the Spanish expulsion from 1492, the Portuguese expulsion decree of 1496, and Italian expulsion, primarily from Sicily in 1492-93, and then in 1510 from Apulia. In the meantime, there were other expulsions from Italy, and for example, in 1502, finally, after expulsion decrees that weren't enacted, the Jews were expelled from Provence. All those people coagulated to Salonika. So it started, in terms of Sephardim, in the 1391 events throughout Spain, where a third of the Jews were forced to convert, a third were killed, a third were left alone, but there were mass migrations already then. Okay, there was something called the Sorgun. It was a forced transfer. Salonika, for example, became Ottoman in 1430. So in about 1450, 1460, because the Ottoman Empire was losing wars to Russia, the Jews had to be transferred from the periphery, which was a place like Salonika, to a major center like the capital, Istanbul. So you had a lot of Jews from the Greek peninsula, from various communities, who were sent to Istanbul. But to get to the main part of the story, the Sephardim mostly couldn't make it to the Ottoman Empire. The Jews of Aragon, who were closest to the Mediterranean, could get out, and they were the first to arrive in Salonika. But the Italian Jews were the ones who actually arrived in Salonika and Istanbul the first. And the Italian Jews, for example, were also in the west of Greece, in the region of Epirus, in communities like Arta. They had 4 synagogues of Italian Jews. These Jews were from Apulia and Sicily. The Jews of Corfu, even from earlier times, from Byzantine times, were already Greek. And then when the Italian expulsees came, but they joined other Italian Jews. So, for example, in a place like Corfu, you had an Apulian and a Sicilian synagogue, and then you had the Judeo-Greek-speaking Greek-Jewish, what are called Romaniot communities. So the Sephardim came to Salonika. The Italians actually were the first to come to the region. It took like 10, 20 years for most of the Sephardim to actually arrive. They came to Salonika because it was a barren place, for all sorts of reasons historically, but they were autonomous. The Ottomans welcomed them, and they didn't bother them. They gave them autonomy. The Spanish expulsion wasn't exactly an expulsion. The Jews couldn't actually leave for the most part. It was more of like a forced transfer to Portugal. There were Jews who bought their way to Portugal, and masses went. But there was an expulsion decree, but it wasn't enacted, and the Jews were duped. They were forced to convert in a public ceremony in the main square at the end of 1496. So all those Jews were called New Christians. In general, they tried to flee from the main cities, and they went to the eastern and northeastern part of Portugal, and there they could remain in villages, and there they could become Marranos, or secret Jews. Those are the Jews who eventually left and made it to the Ottoman Empire. They went, for example, the Inquisition began in Portugal in 1536. So then there was a wave of Jews. Originally, of course, they came after 1496. They came after the 1506 riots against the New Christians in Portugal. And they came at the beginning of the Inquisition, because these Marranos, these secret Jews, or Anusim as we call them in Hebrew, they were heretics. So they could be put to the Inquisition if they were accused of what's called Judaizing. So, but most of these Jews went overland via Italy to get to the Ottoman Empire. They went through Albania. They went through what was the former Yugoslavia. So when they got to Salonika, it took a long time. There are very high population estimates that maybe in the 1520s, 1540s, there were 40,000 people. But to be more conservative, there were about 20,000 people by the beginning of the 16th century. In Salonika, there were 30-some kahalim. A kahal in Judeo-Spanish is a congregation. So they came from various places in Iberia, in Spain and Portugal. In Spain, there were the kingdoms of Aragon, Castilla, Navarra, and in Portugal. So when they came to Salonika, the first wave had the name of the synagogue, for example, Kahal Kadosh Portugal Yashan. They were the old Portuguese. The second generation, of course, they rebelled or split from the first generation, became Kahal Kadosh Portugal Hadash. So that's like the basis of the names, and then they're from various geographical places, like in Portugal, like Évora, or from Castilla, or from Lisbon, from Catalan, or Catalunya. So those are and then of course Provence. A good part of the synagogues also were of Italian origin, so they came from Apulia, they came from Calabria, they came from Sicily, and so until the 1917 fire in Salonika, all those synagogues existed. Their buildings existed. They continued until the Holocaust. But that's the main base of this Sephardic identity of this large, prolific Sephardic community. Now, in terms of population, the population eventually mounted, but it had ups and downs because of the political situation. So, for example, in 1568, the population went down to, let's say, 15,000. But in 1788, it was already at 23,000. In 1862, the population was 38,000. In 1904, it went at the end of the Ottoman Empire, the population was 75,000. In the last year of Ottoman rule, in 1912, the population was 80,000. Then in the Greek period, it's going to go down because of all sorts of anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic events. There was legislation to prevent the Jews from being in national elections. There was a big fire in Salonika, and the Jews got shafted in terms of reparation. Greatly shafted, let's say. The Jews didn't want to go to the Greek army. They didn't want what was called the Greek Republic. They wanted to live in a monarchy where they had their autonomy, and they couldn't have the old Ottoman system. So many migrated. In the 20s and 30s, about 15,000 migrated to France. At the beginning of the 20th century, they migrated to the United States, the Americas, England. In the 1930s, 15 to 18,000 migrated to Eretz Yisrael, primarily to Tel Aviv, after the 1931 Campbell riots. Campbell was the name of a neighborhood in Salonika where people who were refugees from the 1917 fire lived. And they were mostly fishermen and stevedores. The Jews of Salonika controlled the port. And these people, their neighborhood was burned down by Asia Minor anti-Semitic refugees, and they went to Palestine. So at the end of the 30s, the beginning of the 40s, in the Nazi occupation, there were 56,000 Jews in Salonika, but they had a high population rate, a high birth rate. So somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 babies were born a year, so that's why the population became stagnant. At the beginning of the Nazi period, 5,000 to 7,000 Jews escaped from Salonika, but the population, even until the deportations 2 years later, in 1953, it was still 56,000. And then most of those people died in the Holocaust.